Enslaved courtship and marriage. Or really, it's more sort of heterosexual relationships among enslaved people in the antebellum era. What shapes all of these relationships that we're going to be talking about is the Second Middle Passage. And that's the movement of enslaved people from the eastern seaboard states to the interior Southwest. So people moving from places like Virginia and Maryland to Mississippi and Alabama, among other places. This trade focuses on young, healthy, pliable, and fertile people is what they want. So it's young people who are being sent, which of course means that the young people who are forming relationships are particularly at risk of being sold away from their relationships. And in fact, 1 out of 3 first marriages were broken by the interstate trade. About 1 to 1.5 million people were moved in the Second Middle Passage, and about maybe another million almost were moved in a variety of other ways. They were inherited. They were sold in local sales. They were given away as gifts. They were hired out. So there's lots of ways to break relationships. One of the basic realities about marriage under slavery was that marriage was illegal, but very common. It could not be legal because the belief was, in that case, a husband's control over his wife would challenge the control of the enslaver over the enslaved woman. So marriage among enslaved people was illegal. At the same time, most enslaved adults at some point in their lives would marry. Given all the barriers, given the likeliness of heartbreak, why is it that enslaved people married? Harriet Jacobs wrote, "Why does the slave ever love? Why allow the tendrils of the heart to twine around objects which may at any moment be wrenched away by the hand of violence?" Enslavers themselves often encouraged marriage. They saw it as a way to pacify and stabilize enslaved people frequently. Men will be less likely to revolt, the theory was, if they have wives and children. They saw it as fitting their own self-image of themselves as humane paternalists, people who are caring well for their enslaved property. And one of the ways to do that is by allowing them to form families. It encouraged fertility. People were more likely to have children if they were allowed to marry. And I've never seen this directly spoken in some way, but I think there's an underlying logic that it also created hostages. That if you had somebody's spouse, if you had somebody's children, or you could control their access to their spouse or children, that gave you a lot of leverage over a person and ways to force them into obedience. Finding partners could be a problem. Enslavers generally wanted enslaved people to form relationships within their own farm or plantation. So for example, if they have a man and a woman, their ideal would be that they would have children together so that they would not be producing children for some other enslaver. But enslaved people usually resisted that. In 1830, over 40% of enslavers owned only one person. So you could be just the one person on a farm. And if those farms were in rural areas, frontier areas, they often were pretty remote. It could be hard to find other people. In a lot of cases, it's smaller communities. By 1860, almost 90% of enslavers owned 20 or fewer slaves. Most people who were enslaved lived in communities of 5 or 10 or even fewer. So that would make it hard to find a relationship on your plantation or farm. So visiting was the essential practice. Going from one plantation or farm to another. Generally, it was men who were expected to visit their sweethearts and wives, though there were exceptions, women who went instead. While men often knew their way around the territory, there was always the danger of patrollers, and so the best way to go was to get a pass from their enslaver. But that really depended on their whims. Do they feel good about you? Are they happy with you? Are they willing to give you that ability to go and see your loved ones? There are cases where there are very large communities of 100 or more, and in that case, you might actually have people intermarrying within the community. But that was pretty rare. One of the more common types of relationships were sweethearts, particularly among young people. And sweethearts might be lovers, but it was often kept secret, or at least they hoped it was secret. It's hard to keep things secret in a small community. But definitely you try not to let your enslaver know. These were expected usually to become temporary relationships. I mean, maybe it'll evolve into something more serious, or it'll end. And there is a chance that it might result in children because, of course, controlling pregnancy is difficult. But even in that case, maybe it'll become more serious, maybe it won't. The next level of relationship would be taking up. This could be a temporary relationship or a longer term relationship. It was often something that someone who expected to be moved on, for example, let's say you're being leased out, so you're only going to be in this area for a year or two, might form this as a relationship rather than looking for something permanent like marriage. Or someone who just didn't feel like they could make permanent promises or could want to. If possible, they might live together if that was available and allowable according to the rules of the plantation or farm. But they might also be visitors if they're from a different plantation or farm. Once again, that depends on the whims of the enslaver, whether or not they'll provide passes. Sometimes it can result in children, and the relationship might be acknowledged by the community, by the master, but it's definitely not thought of as marriage. It's closer to what we might think of as living together, and there would be no ceremony celebrating the relationship. Courtship leading to marriage was more of a formal process. And at the center of it was male mobility and male initiative. The thing was that men got to travel around a lot more than women. They did errands, they would transport things, they had tasks that would allow them to meet people off of their own farm or plantation. Men were expected to take the first step in a relationship, even though women could have their own ways of initiating a courtship. Historian Tara Hunter, has this great story about Reba, who was a 15-year-old young woman, and even though the men were drawing straws to see who should have the right to court her, she decided to just wait, and she carefully observed all the men around. She decided that the one that she liked the best was Buck. She admired his independence and willfulness, even though those qualities had gotten him beaten. And she contacted him on her own in secret and initiated a relationship. And then they ended up courting and arriving at marriage. A lot of times relationships would be formed or continued at dances or frolics. Enslaved people sometimes held secret dances in the woods, in hidden places. Sometimes the enslaver would hold a dance for people, sometimes just on his plantation, or sometimes for people to come from other plantations as well. Sometimes they held frolics like corn huskings. Basically times for people to meet and display themselves. If you wanted to take that courtship further, if you wanted to make it permanent, you had to get the permission of the people who enslaved you. And that could be hard to get. If you were looking to marry someone from another farm or plantation and they were on bad terms with the person who owned you, or if they were in a bad mood, or if they happened to have other plans for you, or if they wanted to use you sexually. That happened to Harriet Jacobs. She had a young man who was courting her, a young free black man. And basically, she was not allowed to marry him because her owner had sexual designs on her. So it could be difficult, but you had to get that permission in order to have a formal marriage. It was also expected that you go to your parents for permission. And parents might sometimes refuse or try to get you to go with someone else, another suitor that they preferred. They had no real power, really, but they were important in the community, and this was important for the community to show respect for your parents. And when you time to get ready and set up your own household, your parents often would help you with that, help you gather the goods and labor that you're going to need. Men might gather together wood so they could build a cabin or build furniture. Women might try to gather cloth and handkerchiefs and other goods. They both might try to earn a little extra money so they could get a gift for their spouse, something to give them on the occasion of the wedding. Marriage was seen as the most significant and honorable relationship. It was definitely seen as different from sweethearting or taking up. You would get married in public, in front of your community of other enslaved people, sometimes in front of your enslaver. The goal was to have a Christian ceremony, but what was actually possible really depended upon the enslaved person's status in their enslaver's eyes. Most people might get some late refreshments to celebrate their wedding. But if you were a highly regarded enslaved person, if you were seen as special and privileged, they might actually hold a dinner for you and a dance to celebrate your marriage. Often in the ceremony, the enslaver might say a few words to pronounce you married. Sometimes there would be a minister, black or white. However, enslavers had a habit of wanting to undercut those weddings, I guess fearing, not taking these weddings seriously and not wanting to undercut their freedom to destroy these relationships. And so, for example, when administering the ceremony, they might just take up a random book instead of using a Bible to undercut the spiritual seriousness of what was happening. And the promise was to be monogamous. Not that everybody lived up to that. Until death, or given the realities of the situation, until distance or Bakra, the white man, parts them. And that's the reality they just had to face, is they didn't have control over when their relationships might end, regardless of how committed they were to that relationship. And once you had been through the ceremony, you would be acknowledged as spouses. You would have a common surname. You would have, often, if possible, you would live together, share a cabin, though that might actually mean sharing a cabin with another family as well, and you'd have to build some kind of a barrier, a partition with old boards or hanging clothes to have a little bit of privacy. However, more likely, you have to have, instead, you're marrying someone who's not from the same plantation or farm. At that point, you still have to depend on the system of visiting. You have shared children, and you'd be called husband and wife. Sometimes relationships were forced in a number of ways. Enslavers could and did forbid relationships. If you failed to get into a relationship by a certain age, they might just simply assign you someone. whether to encourage fertility or to help manage their own ideas about social order and how communities should work. Sometimes you would be assigned partners regardless of whether or not you were in a relationship, based on ideas of breeding, that these two people would make better children for some reason, or possibly as a reward or punishment. These marriages were not considered real marriages by enslaved people. They did not see them as true spouses. Usually you didn't have a choice but to go along with it. There were people who tried to defy when they were told to do this, and they got whipped until they gave in. You didn't really have a choice, but that didn't make it a marriage. Though those relationships could evolve over time, it could evolve into something close to a real marriage, or it could just be. The other reality of it is the reality of violence, constant violence. One reality was that you were constantly witnessing violence to your spouse, and you were unable to intervene. If you were a husband, that meant you could not protect your wife. And I have read historians speculating that that might have been one of the attractions of an away marriage, was that you wouldn't have to see constantly the kind of abuse that your wife suffered. Rape was a constant risk. And the question is, how does that affect your relationship? Men often understood that it wasn't the woman's choice, but not everybody did. And you also have the entanglements of forced long-term relationships. One historian has a story about an enslaved woman who had been the longtime concubine of her enslaver. He allows her to get married to an enslaved man, her choice, the man she wants to be her husband. But he forces her at her wedding to wear red, which is the color of passion. It's a color of prostitution. It stigmatizes her at the very time of her wedding to try to shame her and maintain his sexual claim. So there is that constant interference. And then finally, there's the question of the children. What happens to the children of violence? A lot of times they're folded into the families that the mother has, but it's not clear how easily that always happened. There's at least one historian who very strongly feels that there was always acceptance, but there's also discussions I've seen of children getting targeted for having light skin. There's also the possibility of white interference. A light-skinned child might be taken away to act as a servant in the house. So what is our conclusions? First of all, enslavers, in a huge variety of ways, undercut and limited relationships. Secondly, enslaved people and community really respected and supported marriage. Enslaved relationships were often disrupted. But having those relationships, all the different types, was key to the individuals and probably to the community's survival. What were some of the sources for this? Anthony Kay's Joining Places, Maria Jenkins Schwartz, Born in Bondage, Tara Hunter, Bound in Wedlock, and Emily West, Chains of Love.